Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, and Chodesh Tov. I'm Avi Grossman, and this is Parsha Talk, and we are very privileged to have Rabbi Eli Duker join us this evening to talk about the Parsha and talk about the haftarot, because we never get to talk about the haftarot or the haftarot. Rabbi Duker, I forget how the connection was made. Rabbi Duker has a series of articles in both Hebrew and English. I think one has been published in quite a nice journal recently. That was just a few months ago. And you could find them also on the Sepharim blog. I'm credited with that. Rabbi Duker brought me aboard to touch up some things and look them over, because he's done some very, very interesting research on the history of the haftarot and the various minhagim. Now, most of us open up our chumash and we follow along with the Torah reading, and then we see, oh, look, very convenient. It tells us this is the haftarah for this week. And every now and then, if we have a good chumash, it tells you there's actually, Sephardim do this way and Ashkenazim do that way, because apparently 100-something or a few hundred years ago at the Kenes Agudas Yisrael and the International Sephardic Conference, they decided all the Sephardim are going to do this way and all the Ashkenazim are going to do that way. And that's the way it was supposed to be, and that's the way it always will be. And nothing has ever changed ever. And every now and then the Yemenites get into the act, and you also see it says, and Yemenites do this. But apparently that's not so true. And one of the things that also is quite interesting about this is it used to be they had even more parshas. That is, they had a cycle of Torah reading in the land of Israel that was unlike the one with which we are familiar. We've mentioned this a few times. They had many more parshas, and it took them 3 years to finish the Torah. And they had a lot more haftarahs to choose from. And it used to be that this was something that was a lot more elastic. Perhaps you could even change the haftarah on a whim. And there is something that's still mentioned in the books, as late as the Mishnah Berurah has this, that, for example, when there was a chassan in town, so at his ofruf, they would read a particular haftarah without regards to whatever the chumash said to do, or something that was related to the parsha. And that's the first clue that perhaps there's much more than meets the eye with regards to the haftarot. So Rabbi Duker, you mentioned this week already, we've seen that perhaps things are going to be different than what it says in my Siddur. It's Parsha Shkolim this week, so shouldn't we be reading the haftarah for Parsha Shkolim?
It should be.
Yeah.
I just want to qualify. Thank you, Rabbi Grossman, for bringing me on and for all of the help that you've had of getting all of the works that you mentioned out. There is an interesting discussion already amongst the Rishonim to what extent the haftarahs are supposed to be fluid. The Gemara, which deals with the Arba Parshios, for example, actually has a machlokas about what the Arba Parshios are. One opinion is, which was the practice in Eretz Yisrael, was that the Arba Parshios, they only read those 4 Parshios that week, and there was no Parshat Shavua. The other approach is that we read the regular Parshat Shavua. That was the practice in Bavel. That's what we do today. And the opinion that holds that way says, let's say that what do you do? That after you finish the Arba Parshos, Chosrin, what does that mean in the Mishnah? The Gemara explains, according to one opinion, let's say they're haftaros Chosrin, which does seem to imply, if one looks at it, that there was some sort of idea already in time of the Gemara that these are the haftaras we read this week. And I would say that regarding a good 80% of the haftaros, with the one exception of the Roman yacht community, who had a totally different tradition than everybody else, the haftaras are the same, and most of the arguments that went on are regarding the remaining 20%. What's been going on today and yesterday, which is interesting because I don't really recall arguments about haftaras on Facebook and Twitter, et cetera, is a discussion about here. For those in Eretz Yisrael, first of all, I'd imagine for those of you who are in other places, over here, meant because of COVID and because the weather is absolute, and it's doable because the weather is absolutely gorgeous. So many of the minyanim have moved outside. If one follows the Ministry of Health regulation, it's practically impossible to have a minyan inside, as only 5 people are allowed to be in a shul at one time. As a result, we have many, many, many outdoor minyanim, and many of those outdoor minyanim only have one Sefer Torah. We know that the halacha is that the normative practice is brought in Shulchan Aruch, that we take out 3 Sifrei Torah this week. It's brought in the Gemara already. That this week is Rosh Chodesh Adar as well, and as is Rosh Chodesh Adar, not only do we read the Parsha Shavua and Parsha Shkalim, but we have to read the reading for Rosh Chodesh as well. Normally, 3 Sifrei Torah are taken out. The question is, what if you don't have 3 Sifrei Torah, which is a very, very, very lemaisa issue, as you have many, many people that do have small minyanim outside in their chatzer, on their merpesed, out in their parking lot, whatever, and only have 1 Sefer Torah. And we know that the Parsha is Mishpatim, and before one gets to, and the laning for Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh is in Pinchas, but the reading for Parshas Shkalim is in Kisisa, which is right nearby. So is one supposed to roll the Sefer Torah all the way back to Parshas, all the way down to Parshas Pinchas, read V'yom HaShabbos Rosh Chodeshechem, and then roll all the way back and read Kisisa? Or can one read Kisisa first? And that's actually been a big discussion today, to what extent we care about the idea of Tadir She'eno Tadir Tadir Kodem on one hand, which is the reason why we read the Rosh Chodesh Parsha first. Yeah. Versus the 2 issues, number 1 of Tircha de Tzibura, which is something which Chazal are very concerned with, and the second issue is Ein Ma'avir and Ala Mitzvos, that we have the right to roll right past Kisisa in order to get to Pinchas and not read it. And there's been a back and forth. The Rav Lau, as well as Rav Stav and certain other rabbis and the religious Zionist community, Rabbi Nohrai, I believe from Beit Hillel, have all said if you only have, so Rav Stav and Rav Lau said that if you only have 1 Sefer Torah, you should read Shkalim before Rosh Chodesh. And since you're reading Rosh Chodesh last, we know that the haftarah follows the last thing that you read, and therefore instead of reading Ben Sheva Shanim or Vayichros or Yadah, depending where you want to start, the haftarah which is brought in the Bavli for Parshas Shkalim, you should read Hashemayim Kisi, which is the haftarah for Parshas Rosh Chodesh, because that's the last thing that you're reading. Rav Norai said the difference is if you have, he seems to be concerned with Tircha de Tzibur, if you could have a speech, or if you're type of meeting with lots of singing and you could take up the time with that and not have any dead time, so therefore it's not really Tircha de Tzibur, and therefore we should follow the regular way. If not, you should follow this. If Usher Weiss wrote a whole thing arguing on this, claiming that one of the reasons why he opposed the idea of switching around the order is that that would change the haftarah, and therefore not only because of, but one of the reasons that he gives that the normative approach should be done is in order to read the haftarah for Parsha Shkalim and not read the haftarah for Rosh Chodesh. So just you should know, haftarahs today are actually a very live wire, or something which I don't recall ever happening. All right, Grossman mentioned before the idea of Eretz Yisrael versus Bavel. In the time of, we know that in Eretz Yisrael there was a triennial cycle. We did not know anything about the triennial cycle until the Cairo Geniza. We know in Cairo it does not rain, and therefore, and the weather is very dry. If you put anything in Shemus and Geniza over there, it stays there forever. And that's what it was. The 19th century people began to discover this and went through all of these things. And recently, Professor Yosef Erfowitz managed to figure out what the haftarahs were throughout the triennial cycle. That's not really the focus of what I am doing.
Okay.
But
It's okay.
But some of these haftarahs have made it into other minhagim, including Ashkenaz, and sometimes we have a focal point regarding haftarahs. A lot of them sometimes brought in the things which came from Eretz Yisrael, which some communities had and some communities did not.
Mm-hmm. So may I ask, or just interject something for our viewers? This is something that was brought to my attention almost 20 years ago by Rabbi Elio Soloveitchik, who starts pointing this out to yeshiva boys who only know the cycle with which they're familiar, the cycle that they do in the shuls now. This Parsha, Parshas Mishpatim, was one of the last Parshiot in history to take on the form that we know. Even as late as some of the Rishonim who had our cycle, they used to have this Parsha as 2 Parshas. They used to stop it in Kesef. And even in for example, the Sefer HaChinuch, you see evidence. He has our Parshas, except for what? He has a Parsha im Kesef, where they used to stop in the middle. And indeed, that was also the triennial cycle, had to stop it right there. And it's actually, I think, quite better that it doesn't stop there, because the verse right before that is, my anger shall flare against thee, and your children will be orphans, and your wives shall be widows. Or is it the other way around? Either way, it's pretty terrible. So it's good that we don't stop there. And yeah, and the other thing I had about what you were saying with this this idea that's going to be happening this week, where we could actually perhaps see that at one minyan on the street, they're going to be reading Hashemayim Kis'i, because the last reading from the Torah will be from Rosh Chodesh, whereas the other people will be reading I guess it's the haftarot from 2 Kings about Joash's special new system for collecting the temple funds. So that will be the haftarah for those who read the shkalim last, as the usual practice. The problem that I had with all these considerations was, you brought up tircha de tzibur. The Gemara says you're not supposed to roll the Sefer Torah in public. You're supposed to have the Sifrei Torah already in place where they're supposed to be, so that they can be read without this break. But the problem is that nowadays, we've sort of, for hundreds of years now, we've basically let this principle of tircha de tzibura fall by the wayside. We have made the services, especially on Shabbatot and Rosh Chodesh, we have added everything under the sun, and speeches and announcements and everything. Anything could be added at the end. I remember even being in that shul where I thought they were finally done, and then they decided to throw in Hatikva after Adon Olam for good measure. And it seems that this is the least bit of tircha de tzibur to roll a Sefer Torah, especially if the Rav or whoever is going to be making his remarks during that time. 2 people are going to be rolling, so he'll give the people a little bit of a sermon, or perhaps divrei halacha. I don't think it's so much of a tircha de tzibur, considering that we don't follow this principle anymore. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I would say that the different times,
yes,
davening took on a different role and was done differently. Number one, the fact is that obviously in the time and what's considered to be a tircha de tzibur and what's not, the same time of Chazal, when they viewed rolling the Sefer as tircha de tzibura, the entire Torah was translated into Aramaic, and the laning would take a very, very long time, particularly in Bavel, where you had where the parshas were annual. In Eretz Yisrael, where in both Bavel and in Eretz Yisrael, this is the week of Parsha Shkalim, when we still have many communities that recite the piyutim for Be'elazar HaKalir, both at Shacharis and at Musaf. Yes. But in both in Eretz Yisrael and in Bavel, in the period of the Gaonim, many piyutim were said. We have piyutim that were, and that's one of the sources that I've been using to try to figure out what the haftarahs were in the 7th, 8th centuries, more or less every Shabbos. Even in those days, there were often communities that we have sources in the Geniza about the shul in Cairo, where somebody decided to write piyutim, and everybody was just super annoyed, and only him and the 3 guys that got the thing with him cared what was going on. So the issue of how long shul is supposed to be and what is done in shul definitely has taken on different things, whether it's the targum, whether it's the piyutim, and all that does take into this idea of that rolling the Torah is seen as a tircha de tzibura. Whether or not what Chazal would have said about some things that go on in today's shuls, I don't know. Mishaberach, etc. They obviously play a less important role than the targum did in antiquity and the like. The idea of a drasha in the shul seems to go back either before or after davening to antiquity. Might have been the original purpose of the shul of the Beit Knesset in the first place, like we found in the an inscription in Ir David that it talked about the synagogue, the theological inscription there talked about the synagogue that was there for it in Greek for study of the law. And later on, after the Churban, it took much more role of Tefillah B'Tzibur. But so what exactly is defined as Tircha de Tzibura regarding what we do in our davening? Maybe yeah, maybe no. I honestly don't know and don't feel I could really weigh in on that particular Nakuda. I hear you're coming from, though.
Okay, yeah, I was just saying, in consideration at this point, I would lean toward those people who say roll it and keep the order as is, because we don't seem to be that machmir. Just to close with this, I mean, not close our interview, but just to close the idea, as I think the Rambam was fighting a losing battle, because he, if you see in his tshuvas, was very machmir with regards to Tircha de Tzibura. He said no piyutim whatsoever. We know that he did not win that argument. People were still composing piyutim, and piyutim caught on, especially before the yeshiva, before the Volozhin yeshiva. Piyutim were a major part of the Ashkenazic service, not just on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And you could see that. You see that still in some of the old Sidurim. And there are some places where they still say them, even though if it's not that common, and especially because people are coming out of the yeshivas and they're not doing it anymore. The Rambam was so opposed to Piyutim, he didn't even say Kel Adon on Shabbos. And many of us think that's just part of the bracha before, that's part of the Yotzer or bracha, but it's apparently not. He was so opposed to that. So let me ask you, how did you get involved in researching the haftarot? And how does one go about doing that kind of research? How do you do it? Well, why do you do it? How do you do it?
Fine. I'll start with the first thing. In 2012, my grandmother, Alala Shalom, fell, and she was taken to the hospital, and I spent Shabbos in the hospital in Hadass Ein Karim with her. It was Parshas Vayishlach. Mm-hmm. And every single shul I've been in the world, Parshas Vayishlach reads Chazon Ovadiyahu, which talks about Edom, which is obviously the focus of the Parsha. And I was davening at, I think, the Kivasikin minyan over there, and there was some British fellow who had the Haftarah, and he read Va'amis Luim using the German trup, which is prevalent in London. And when I was wondering what's going on over here, so everybody else was telling me, no, this is what Ashkenazim do. Now it's kind of confused. What are you talking about? I've never seen Ashkenazim do that. Yeah. Which let me look into the idea that maybe there's something going on, and indeed there is a different practice in England than the rest of the planet regarding the Haftarah of Parshas Vayishlach. That took me back to the fact that some of us remember in the pre-Art Scroll period, those who grew up in American shuls, where the standard English Chumash was the Hertz Chumash. Yes. The Hertz Chumash was from England, and there was always, and I had some vague remember of there being confusion because it would say that Chazon Ovadia was the Haftarah for Sephardim, but I davening in a regular Ashkenazi shul growing up, that was read anyway, which made me wonder about what the story with that particular Haftarah is, and from there I jumped to other things. There's also a Rav Shechter, the last time Rav Shechter gave when I was in his shir in, I believe it was 1997 or 1998, I don't remember, we could look it up, was the last year that both the Haftarahs for Acharemos and Haftarahs for Kedoshim were read. And Rav Shechter gave...
Was the last time? That was the last time that Kaviyah was in place? Interesting. What? I have to check that. Because that would depend on the Kaviyah, assuming that there's 14 different ways that the Jewish calendar can fall out. The calendar, not looking at the Torah, just the dates of the holidays with regards to the Gregorian calendar. Yeah. There's 14 different Kaviyahs. So, and then once you have the Kaviyah and you're assuming that you have your set Haftarah Minhagim, so that Kaviyah, I guess, was the last time was 97. Okay. I haven't kept track of that.
Either 97 or 98. It was one of those 2 years.
Okay.
We have a whole thing about it, and that sort of piqued my interest as well. Something lay dormant. I gave a shir Shabbos. I gave a shir in a shul here in Ramat Beit Shemesh from 2001 until Parshas Para last year, when all hell broke loose and nothing is going back to normal. And I always need a topic to research, so this went along with that as well. Regarding how one goes about researching Haftarahs, so things are constantly getting updated. Is there any way that I could share my screen?
Yeah, so you look at the bottoms over there. I see it underneath where it shows the smaller camera view. One of them is mute, stop cam mic, and share. It's an icon. It shows like a computer screen with a plus sign right next to the invite. It's a person icon with the plus. Do you see it? Yeah, okay, please share it.
Okay. Just give me
I've never done a share screen all these times. I thought to do it. I did it when we had a Hebrew thing.
For example, if we want to start with the
did you start sharing already? Because I don't see it.
You don't see it? I'm sorry.
I can ask one of the viewers. Did you press confirm or one of those things that has to?
I see your entire screen. Share.
That's your own personal view. So maybe if you send me a link in some other way, Yeah, my daughter's trying to show me what to do. That's pretty cool. If you share me a link, I could try sharing it but you see the option for sharing, right?
Yeah, I clicked on it. Your entire screen. 1 second.
He's trying to share the screen right now. He's trying to share his screen so he can show us something. Meanwhile, I'll ask you about just the side question that saying I don't know what. Okay, here. Add the stream. There you go. But Rabbi Duker, before you tell me what we have here, I want to ask you something, which you totally surprised me. Normally, thank God, because you've the last 3 years you've involved me with this, I don't get surprised that much anymore. As a matter of fact, I expect these surprises, so they're not surprises. But you just surprised me with something. I know that since I was a kid, sometimes I would be in shul. There was one shul that was sort of very Hasidish where I grew up, but the Baal Kriya was a total yeki. And he does the Western European style tune for reading the Torah, where the Mercha Tipcha series and Sof Pasuk and Esnachta is the same as, let's say, the Litvish Eastern European, and also Zakef Katon a little bit. But the opposite. The flourishes, the minor stops, like what do you call it? The Yershayim and Kadmava Azla, the Tlishas, etc., sound normal. But as you get to the end of the pasuk and the Mapach Pashta Zakev Katon and Mercha Tipcha, that sounds totally off. It sounds more like Mercha Tipcha Esnachta Mercha Tipcha Sof Pasuk, which just hits you the wrong way. But I know that's the way they do it. They have a different tune for the Haftarah also?
Yakis, sure.
Oh boy. And what does it sound like? Or, I mean, maybe I could go.
Hashem Elokeinu melech olam asher bachar bin b'yim tovim v'ratzav divrayim anemarim b'emes. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Sure.
Oh boy. I guess that sounds jarring to us bored and true Litvoks. I figure in most let's say Young Israels and Young Israel type shuls that it's very uncommon.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Good to know. And ironically, I've learned how to do the way the Sephardim and the French people do it. I lean more for the Sephardim nowadays than I do for the Ashkenazim. But and I've learned most of their things, but I still couldn't do it I couldn't read the Haftarah like a good Yeki. I guess I should learn that sometime. Okay. So what do you have for us here on the screen?
This is a Geniza fragment.
Okay.
On the top we see the end of Parshas Pinchas, which exists according to the most minhagim. It's pretty, with the exception of the Yemenites that read it in the vast majority of the years, because they have the practice of combining Chukas and Balak when other communities, Ashkenaz and Sephardi, combine Matos and Maseh. In most years we don't read the Haftarah for Pinchas because it's part of the 3 weeks we read special Haftarahs. But we see this on the top over here. But it's a rarity, but it's definitely read in Ashkenazi and Sephardi shuls today, as well as amongst meaning it's read in all communities today. And amongst Ashkenazi and Sephardi, it's a bit of a rarity. But after that, we have the Haftarah of Rashi Hamatos. It says Vayitain Moshe. If you look at the Nun Sofit, it's very, very, very cursive. This is a form of Oriental script, so that tells you that we're dealing with something in Bavel. I'm not a big expert. I was told we're talking about 9th, 10th centuries.
Okay.
Based on the curviness of the script. And we see a different Haftarah of Vayitain Moshe, which is not the Haftarah that we read. We read for Parshas Matos is always read during the 3 weeks, and therefore we read Divrei Yirmiyahu. But over here we have one of the in Bavel. However, this practice had not yet gotten over there, and therefore they had Haftarahs. Our practice is that once Shiva Asa B'Tammuz hits, we no longer read Haftarahs which are connected to the Parsha at all. We read Haftarahs which are connected to the time of year. By the way, Rabbanit Dr. Naomi Cohen wrote a fascinating article claiming that this practice goes back to the Beis Hamikdash itself.
Wait, which practice? The practice of the Tlusim?
Reading the Haftarahs of Nechama, she says.
Okay, Nechama, okay.
That even though the Beis Hamikdash was standing, she claims, this is her idea, that if Philo is constantly quoting Chumash, and he very rarely quotes from Navi. If he's quoting from Navi, it must be that's what they read in the Haftarahs in Egypt. And many of the Haftarahs, and many of the quotes that he has from Nevi'im are from the 7 Haftarahs of Nechama. And and from the haftarah we read on Shabbos Shuvah. So she wants to claim this practice goes to even before the Churban. But nonetheless, there were in Bavel, the practice was still read haftarahs based on the Parsha. During this time period, this haftarah is still read today in Italian communities, meaning both in Rome and in Yerushalayim, where they only read special haftarahs during the month of Av.
So wait a minute, this haftarah that I see here, isn't this the one that the Rambam says is also the
Rambam? Right. This appears in the Rambam's list. The Rambam's list qualifies it though, and says that at the end says that the Rambam in the Yad says we actually had a discussion, Avi, about the idea of whether or not the gear says minag bit. I thought it was our city, Arenu, our town, Irenu, and you pointed was Arenu, our towns. It seems like the Rambam definitely himself, he was aware of these haftarahs. He probably did not read them. He probably read the haftarahs that we read.
Interesting.
So right over here, with a bit of looking around a bit, and with a combination of searching, and once you find one thing, or knowing how certain parts of the catalog works, once you find one, you could find a lot of them nearby. So you're able to find actual fragments from the Cairo Geniza on this website of your Friedberg, which gives you the ability of knowing what was going on at different, let's call it undated time periods, from whatever was found in the Geniza in Cairo. I found a list of what seems to be Sephardi haftarahs over there. It's a whole mix and match over there, but you definitely have a lot of practices of both Bavli and Eretz Yisrael as were done in Egypt in those days. Right over here, we have you're looking at this thing going round and round and round with the library shut down. The website of the National Library is not working as well as it should. Sometimes you have to play around and work different browsers. And even though the vast majority of us are totally accustomed, our meaning is to only use Google Chrome for anything and everything. What? No?
You said our minhag, yes.
Yes, but sometimes you have to go to like whatever Gilgal Explorer is on a Microsoft Edge or something like that for better luck over here. But generally speaking, you can search not only can you search a specific manuscript on the Ktiv website over here, but if you could even if you put in haftarot, Ashkenaz or stuff like that, it'll bring you all of the manuscripts over there. The third thing that's going on is printed books and early Chumashim. And the most of these are still on microfilm. A few of them have been digitized, and it's a long process, but it's going on. And just in the past few months, I came across this, which is a Chumash from Portugal from 1494, which is a very significant year because we know that the expulsion took place in 1492.
Yes.
And in 1497, the king of Portugal, who was single, Alfonso, wanted to make a shidduch with the king, with the daughter of the king and queen of Spain, who both had made a t'nai in the shidduch. They refused to allow the marriage to go through unless they only agreed to let the marriage go through if he expelled all the Jews from Portugal. Many Jews from Spain had run away to Portugal as well as the people that were there beforehand. But this really gives us a very rare window into what was going on. I'm not sure whether it's among Spanish refugees or among the native, let's call it Portuguese community. Not really clear. The idea of there being Spain was a relatively new concept in those days, as the king of Castile and the queen of Aragon just got married. But this gives you a window to where things were before the year 1497, which was when this marriage took place. We know that the king did not end up expelling the Jews. He said he was going to. And as the Jews prepared to leave, though, he realized that he would be very bad for the Portuguese economy if he let the Jews go. Yeah. So he sent priests to the shipyard where they were about to leave from and just baptized all of them, announced they're Christians, and forced them to abandon Judaism there. So, but during this time period, between the beginning of printing and the expulsion, the majority of books that were printed in Portugal were Hebrew books, Sfarim. We have Gemaras, we have Torahs, we have Chumash, we have Navi, and this is what's left from Chumash in a place called Raisha in Portugal, from around 1494. And in it, what's very interesting is that they have there's not that much of it that survived. But from what survived over here, if you look at this is the haftarah for Korach, which is the standard haftarah in all communities nowadays. But next, which is when we read about Vayomer Shmuel Ala'am. However, afterwards, it gives an alternative haftarah without explaining. It's Korach Treyasar, Chalak Libam, which is a haftarah which we don't know of any other communities that follow the normative, let's call it haftarahs, which came from Bavel did. This haftarah which was read in Eretz Yisrael for the Sidra of Korach, which was kept by the Greek-speaking Jews, the Ramanyats, who even though they switched the annual Salah, kept the haftarahs of Eretz Yisrael. But smack over here in this Chumash, which is only like 7 pages are left from it, we see this other Eretz Yisrael haftarah, which seemed like it was read by either a Portuguese community, a Spanish community. I haven't found it anywhere else. If you go on a little bit more, you continue to see, then for Chukas, you see Yiftach Giladi, which was the standard universal practice. But afterwards, when you go to Pinchas, again, you see V'yad Hashem Haisal Eliyahu, which is the standard minhag nowadays we saw for Pinchas, going back to the Geniza. But then next to it, we have V'yesh Matim, Brisi Aisa Ito Achayim V'Hashalom. This is also a haftarah from Eretz Yisrael that they would read, because the Pinchas starts with Hinin and saying Lo as Brisi Shalom. So they would read Brisi Aisa Ito Achayim V'Hashalom. We have one other source, one catalog of Spanish haftarahs from the 1300s mentions this as well. So it was Delon, but since the period of printing is the only one that we found of this, and this is which is really, really a gold mine of things that we see. Chaval, we don't have the rest of the Chumash. It all makes you wonder what would be there. So that's just an overview of a combination, if one wants to research this, of looking at the 4 things of Geniza fragments, old Chumash manuscripts, printed books throughout the ages, and different haftarahs of a different dynamic, in which case the arguments about them and development took back in different stages, and Yotzros and Piyutim that were written based on haftarahs. That many communities out of practice that they recited Piyutim every single week. So the Piyutim between Shema and Shmona Esrei, sometimes called MS because it was said after the first word of the bracha, sometimes called Zulas because it was said after Ein Elokim Zulasecha. That part, some Paitanim would use that as a way of discussing the haftarah. So from there, we could see what haftarahs were read early on. We're talking about already 8th, 9th, 10th, basically 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th century, when that style of piyut was widespread and people were writing them.
Wow. So one of these things that I realized when you were first showing me your research. Wow, look at that. Okay, I'm gonna. Are you done with the screen? Should I remove the share screen?
I should be okay for now. Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things that you made me realize early on, and also you've reminded me now, is that basically the advent of the printing press and mass producing chumashim and other texts that have one particular minhag in them is that it steamrolled what was once upon a time something was much more varied. You could find different haftarahs in different cities, even in one country. Let's say you brought the example what happened in Amsterdam when they started printing chumashim. So the printer put down the minhagim with which he was familiar in his chumash, and then that chumash made its way beyond his town, and suddenly they were opening up the chumashim, and it says this is the haftarah it's supposed to be. And perhaps there's some old timers and said, no, we remember. Take the example you just brought now. 97 was the last time the certain haftarahs were read, and by the time that would roll around the next time, they would open up the chumash and says, read this haftarah instead. And now they've lost their practices. They basically got steamrolled and homogenized. Someone said it's
This absolutely happened. In part because keeping in mind that even though there was in the early days of printing, so people did not want to print chumashim amongst Jews. They preferred to print the Torah, which is the main halacha sefer, and Gemaras. Why? Because in the earlier days, 1470s, 1480s, the technology was not yet available for Nikud.
Okay.
Therefore, people stayed away from chumashim, where they printed chumashim without nekudos, which for those that were familiar with chumashim manuscripts just did not cut it. By this point, we see already that by the 1490s, we see that they have that technology had developed. But the main printing that took place in afterwards, starting in Venice in 1516, 1517. There was a Belgian Christian Bromberg who had an agenda to print the entire Jewish library.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Why? Either there are those who think that he was trying to do it to try to convert Jews to Christianity. It doesn't seem very likely. It seems that he genuinely loved Hebrew, which was sort of in those days, loved the Jewish book, and had an agenda to print them all. He thought that he would, in order to get the proper licenses, or just because of who he knew, if he would have Christians do the initial legwork, it would be more legal. And the first Chumash that he printed out in 1516 actually was put out by a convert to Christianity, Meshumad Felix Pratensis. We don't even know what his original Hebrew name is. And I don't know, and therefore, as a person who clearly didn't go to shul and stuff like that, I don't know how he got the information about like what the Ashkenazim, what the Sephardim read. Keeping in mind that we're dealing with a time in which the Ashken Sephardim had recently, basically, whatever ones we're dealing with only a quarter of a century after the expulsion from Spain, 20 years after the forced conversion in Portugal. And whenever people managed to escape from Portugal afterwards or left Spain in 1492, are beginning to join communities that already had their own establishment hagim, and therefore what he decided the Sephardi minhag was, as you pointed out, was not necessarily universal Sephardi minhag beforehand, but became known as the Sephardi minhag. If you look, like for example, middle of Parshas, and he was even very self-aware of how much he didn't care about this stuff. Like he clearly put the haftarahs there because he needed to sell the book. Like for example, in the middle of Parshas, in the haftarah for Bereshis, he writes in the middle of the haftarah, Ad kan misaimim miktsas haYehudim. Here's where some of the Jews finished haftarah. He doesn't write miksa kilos, right? Yeah, those Jews who have this weird practice of reading haftarahs and are just not interested in the Hebrew Bible. This is where some of them finish it off, like a phrase that we don't really see anywhere else. Usually say ktsas kilos or something like that. But he clearly was somebody who was motzi atzmo min haklal. And really, really what came out of Venice and then later Amsterdam, a lot of stuff stuck, as pointed out. Regarding Parshas Vayetze and Parshas Vayishlach, it's fascinating that you often have situations today that are practiced through Chazon Ovadia in the vast majority of communities outside of parts of the Commonwealth of Nations, where they have the practice of reading Vamis Luim, even though that's a recent practice due to the Gra and others that brought back what was the original haftarah in Ashkenaz, but was not the standard haftarah for the few hundred years before the Gra.
Oh, so now you mentioned the Vilna Gaon. That's actually kind of interesting for me. Is there any? Is that the only example you have of the Vilna Gaon recommending a particular haftarah against what people believe to be the haftarah?
No, there's another one, and there's a lot. There's a lot of discussion about this, about the original manuscripts of the Ma'aser Rav. The other one is that the conventional wisdom, and I'm not going to go with that, going through this too much, because I believe that the arguments about that haven't been published yet, but that the practice is that there is a practice which goes back to the 11th century, if not earlier, to read Va'arva on Erev Pesach that falls out on Shabbos, and many communities read it on every single Erev Pesach. The Gra was of the opposite opinion, that even though it seems from the earlier Rishonim, that if there was a practice to read the special haftarah of Arva on Shabbos HaGadol, it was done only on Erev Pesach. However, the Gra had the opposite opinion, that should be reversed, that according to what's written in the printed Ma'aser Rav, is that this year the regular haftarah for Tzav should be read because it's Erev Pesach.
Mm-hmm. So the Vilna Gaon basically wants the haftarah almost to coincide when the rabbi gives his drasha, and not which is the actual Shabbos HaGadol.
No, he feels that because he says the reason for reading Va'arva L'Hashem, because it talks about the mitzvah of biur maasros, of removing one's maasros from the house. In a year when it's Erev Pesach, you have to do it by Erev Pesach. So in a year when Shabbos is before Erev Pesach, it's an appropriate haftarah to read. If Erev Pesach is on Shabbos, you're supposed to do it beforehand. So he said it's not I don't want to say he says, it's written the printed version of the Ma'aser Rav, and there are bigger mumchim mikim in these matters than I am, but at least that's what it says over there. Those are the two examples of, we know, the Gra interfering when it comes to haftarot. The main one which he had an effect on was Parshas Vayishlach, where he brought back the original haftarah of Chazon Ovadia, because his view on that only became well known after the third printing of the Chayei Adam, which was printed posthumously, but that was clearly the last thing which the author of the Chayei Adam wrote, that the haftarah for, that he mentions that his Mechut Negra held that the haftarah for Parshas Vayishlach should be Chazon Ovadia and not Vamisluim, which was the previous practice. It's also interesting, it's also important to point out, but the main influence of the Gra had on haftarahs was not what should be read, generally speaking, unless the Gra felt that there was a Gemara which argued he generally was not interested in weighing in on knocking off minhagim of haftarahs. I don't think they were important enough to them where there's no isser in reading this one versus that one. Vayishlach is a little bit exceptional because we have one haftarah which is brought in all of the Rishonim as well as and all of the earlier sources. But the main influences the Gra had is that he felt that people should be writing, that there is a mitzvah not only to write Sifrei Torah, but to write Nevi'im and Ksuvim as well on a klaf, like a Sefer Torah. And due to his influence, we have this amazing thing that even though this did not really go on anywhere else in the world, people began to write in Lithuania and Lithuanian communities in other places. People began to write Sifrei Nevi'im and read the haftarahs from them. The idea of reading a haftarah from a klaf is something which really not just a klaf, but a klaf which is not just have the haftarahs, which is the view of the Levush. The idea of having a complete Sefer Yoshua and using that to read the haftarahs is something which comes from the Gra.
Interesting. So I thought that I was earlier today. I was just reminded of something that was in the back of my mind, but most people aren't aware of this. There's I think some Rishonim offer that the whole idea of haftarahs themselves were not an institution of Chazal L'Chadchila, but something to make up with for something that's, I guess, unrecorded in our history, and the Chazal don't mention this, that they started reading haftarahs because there was a point of persecution. They can't even track it. Was it the Greeks or the Romans or someone else? There was time persecution, and they couldn't even read the Torah in public. So they adopted reading the haftarah, something relevant to remind them of what the Torah was being read. But now they think about it, I don't buy that necessarily. I don't think it's certainly far from unanimous among Rishonim. I think that just reading the Rambam and the Vilna Gaon, for example, and perhaps even more the light that you've shed on all these matters, and the way the Gemara talks about it, and the fact that the Vilna Gaon was trying to tell us, yes, do it like klafta, like the way it's supposed to be, I would figure that reading from the prophets is very similar to reading from the Torah and reading from the Ksuvim also. There are times when the Gaon also says you shouldn't read Shir HaShirim when they do read it on Passover or Koheles on Sukkot. You shouldn't read them from a printed chumash or whatever you have. You should read them properly written on klaf and say the brachas like you would. Just like we read the Torah with brachas on a properly written klaf, according to the Masorah. And just like we read the scriptures, the Ksuvim, also from properly written scrolls on klaf with the brachas, so too the sages ordained that we read from the prophets from klaf and with the proper brachas beforehand, and that's a lichatchila enactment. It was not made in response to any persecution or anything like that, and that's why also I feel like I wish I could point this out, but that's the feeling I got from reading just the end of Megillah. Also, Megillah, that is not the scroll of Esther, but the tractate which we are reviewing now. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
You brought up a few points, and
Okay.
I hopefully caught the main ones, and I have to respond them in order. The source for the idea that it's clear that haftarahs have been around for a long time. It's clear that haftarahs have been around. We have not one but two things mentioned in the Christian Bible, that are clearly referring to haftarahs. It was clear from that this was a standard practice, that the Torah was read followed by the Nevi'im already during the Bayis Sheni. The idea which you're talking about, that this took place because of the persecutions in the time of Antiochus IV, the earliest source that we have for that is the Abu Darham. The Abu Darham, amongst the Rishonim, is the one who focused, I would say, the most on liturgy and regarding, and because he put so much of an effort both into the lanings, the haftarahs, as well as Nusach HaTfilah, so his book was very popular, was very widespread, was printed over and over again, and therefore many achronim afterwards followed this view, as well as, for that matter, some of like the earlier historians in the 19th century went along with this idea, an alternative idea, which is not the exact same thing, is that in the period following those persecutions, Chumashim were the main source that we have, which would go along these things, is that we know that from the book of Maccabees that the Seleucids were interested, as many enemies of the Jewish people were in future generations, of particularly destroying the Sefer Torah. Mm-hmm. Therefore, it's clear that there were not that many Sefer Torah around in the period before and in the aftermath of Hanukkah. It would make, and therefore, another idea floating around is that people read the Haftarah just because those were the only books that they had. Mm-hmm. Meaning similar to a boy who there was a boy who showed up in the Mir in the 1970s in the big Russian Aliyah, and met Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, and he apologized and said that he doesn't really know the stuff the boys did over here. All that he knows is Bava Kam, Bava Mitzia, Bava Basa, because they were the only Masechtas that they had, and that it's not, and that it could be that Sefer Torah, that there was a dearth of Sefer Torah afterwards, and therefore people had to read something. That is another possibility. Definitely, as you pointed out, the early Rishonim, starting with Sefer Pardes and Rashi, do not see things in that way, and they do not view the reading of that. They understand that there is a chiyuv to learn Tanakh daily. That is, and on Shabbat, and nowadays on during the week, people just don't have time to learn that much Navi, and therefore we say the psukim of from Uvalat Zion in order to say something on Shabbos when there's more time. So people have the time to study Navi formally, and that's what the haftarahs were according to the Beis Medrash of Rashi. So there's definitely there is definitely that. Whether or not that ties into whether or not the how people should be reading it, and what kind of what kind of type of book they should be reading from is a very different issue. There were many communities, that non-Ashkenazi communities, that would read from handwritten chumashim for the Parsha Shavua as well. And there were communities that did not really use Sefer Torah all that much, or if they had one, they had one. If not, they read from a chumash. This was the Ashkenazim never did this, and the combination of Rabbeinu Tam being opposed to the practice, Michad Gisa in France, and the Rambam being opposed to this practice in Spain, and said you have to read from a Sefer Torah, led to a practice where the situation where people don't read from a chumash, where people stop reading from a chumash. Derech Agav, this really affects this week as well. The Rashba does say that if you don't have 3 Sifrei Torah for Parshas Shkalim, then better to read Ki Sisa from a chumash, then roll back and forth, etc., because the Tircha de Sipur thing, we obviously don't do this nowadays, but that's clearly maybe the last hurrah of a public reading from a chumash that we have in the Rishonim. Regarding the Haftarahs, so it is very clear that in the medieval period, people were reading from Chumashim. They were not reading from a cloth. They were reading from a codex. They were reading from usually in the handwritten Chumashim. You have Haftarahs in the back, and that's what they were reading from. There was and already we have it's already brought on the Beis Yosef, for example, quotes opinions that. The reason why that you're allowed to, that the idea that you're not allowed to skip what on the Gemara says you're not allowed to skip from one Navi to another, that we know that Sephardi communities have the practice. If it's that, if for example this week or the Shabbos Rosh Chodesh, if they're reading the regular Haftarah, they're going to also read the first pasuk and the last pasuk of the Haftarah for Shabbos Rosh Chodesh. How could you do that? You're skipping from Navi to Navi. Beis Yosef says is no, because since we're not reading from a scroll anyway, so therefore it's all reading from a chumash anyway. So therefore, what's the difference? That definitely became the standard practice relatively early on before the Gra came about and created this new reality in Lithuania.
Okay, so now before we wrap up, we have a question from one of the viewers. He asks, this is for both of us, does any of this tie into the question of whether you make a bracha when you read from the 5 Megillas, or is that unrelated? That's kind of interesting because what you just said, people were reading from a printed chumash or a handwritten chumash, not a Sefer Torah, and they were saying the brachas on it. And the practice still in most places is we read the haftarah from something that is not a scroll of the Navi. Yet we know that we only say the brachas on one of the Megillas if it's actually written out onto the scroll. We don't have anybody who takes a Shir HaShirim and says a bracha on that if it's not written properly on cloth. Is that related to this? And now I think it's a good question. Yeah, please.
The practice in early Ashkenaz was to actually do exactly that. And they would read these Megillas from a Chumash, whatever they had. The almost all the Chumashim and manuscript that I've seen, I'm talking about dozens, do have the Chumash Megillas written in the back.
And they would say brachas on those?
What?
And would they say a bracha on that or not?
And yes, then the standard practice in early Ashkenaz before the Ramah was to say a bracha on it. The Ramah said, the Ramah says as a tshuva where he says, because we're not reading from a scroll, we're not going to make a bracha. There's very, very interesting, humorous piece in the Levush about it. The Levush quotes people as saying that everybody's practice is to say the brachas to themselves and read it to themselves. We've seen, there are many Hasidic communities today that they read the Megillas themselves. But the Levush quotes people saying that the practice, everybody says the bracha to themselves and read it. And he asks, if everybody's saying it to themselves, how in the world do you know that they're making a bracha? You never actually heard it.
Yeah.
So the practice but definitely at the Ramah essentially removed the bracha because there was no scroll. The Gra encouraged the scroll and therefore brought the bracha back.
So was the Ramah consistent? The Ramah what about haftarahs? Would the Ramah say because you're reading the haftarah from a non-scroll, you're reading from a chumash or the Sefer Haftarahs, whatever it is, how would the Ramah justify saying the brachas on that?
I don't know. Before the Levush, it was just taken for granted. I could say, historically speaking, the issue was until the Levush raised the issue and said, what right do we have to read haftarahs from chumashim? We should the Gemara talks about the idea that even though theoretically speaking you're not allowed to write a book of haftarahs, you're only allowed to write a book which has the entire Navi in it. But he says it's too hard to have everybody have entire scrolls of Nevi'im. Therefore, they would have some sort of, it's not clear what it means, but it seems like they would have books of haftarahs and they would read from that. That's already brought in the Gemara. The Levush is the first person to raise the topic that he felt that even if you're going to have a book with haftarahs, which the Gemara explicitly permits, and that's probably, but he says, nonetheless, it has to be written according to all the rules of Stam. You can't just write Hebrew words in every way you want to, or read from a printed thing and read from that. And he brought up the issue. In earlier time periods was not an issue. It was assumed because the Gemara says that one is allowed to write a Sefer Haftarah, so essentially anything goes. Mm-hmm. And why were you allowed to make a bracha on it? Presumably because that was a takanas chachamim. Therefore, a takanas chachamim, you do because of this Gemara that you could write a Sefer Haftarah. Gemara does not weigh in about other Megillos because the Bavli doesn't say there's any obligation to read them ever. Besides that's there, which tells you how they have its rules.
Very interesting. So, Rabbi Duker, we have to thank you. This has been fascinating, enlightening, and perhaps even made me want to ask a lot more questions. But our time is at an end. So we'll just have to thank you again.
Hey, thank you for joining in, and it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and everybody watching there, don't forget, check out Rabbi Duker's articles. Google it. Go to the Sepharim blog. And I thank him for joining us and for allowing me the opportunity to be involved in this fascinating research and topic. And don't forget, everybody, like, share, and subscribe. Send in your questions or comments, or just send your hellos, whatever you like. And we'll see you next week. Same time, same place. Be well and Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.